So I'm going to be talking about consciousness, language, and computers, and I'm going to say a few things about social interaction and game theory. I think this will be fun. I hope you'll enjoy it. I kind of have this presentation separated into like different parts, and at the end of each part I have like a summary, and that's where we can like talk about, I don't know, questions about what I'm saying, or debate, or vehemently disagree, or whatever. Just have a short discussion. So just a little bit about like my own background. I was a UX designer for the past 9 years. I still am a UX designer, but I was working at Vivint Smart Home, and I was a lead designer over some of the products that were powered by AI, at least we called it AI, and that just meant that we were working on trying to model the occupancy of a home. So if people are home, if they're away, or if they're asleep, or on vacation, and then try to automate that. And the problems that I was dealing with was, how do you make the system usable for the user when they're dealing with automation? And we also explored a lot of interaction models relating to conversational interfaces. So I've kind of done a lot of research in that area, and I've kind of talked to larger audiences about some of the usability issues regarding speech or voice interfaces and chatbots. But I'm not actually going to talk much about that today. I am really interested in the philosophy of AI. It's just kind of my hobby. I have two main parts to this presentation. So the first part is just about consciousness, language, and a little bit about social interaction. And then I'll say a few things about consciousness and computers. Before I get into the first part, I want to say that the philosophy that I'm going to be sharing today is mostly influenced by one philosopher, and his name is John Searle, and he's been a professor at Berkeley for the past 50 years. And he's a philosopher that has engaged a lot with the neuroscience community. He's affected neuroscience research through his philosophy, and I can tell you a little about that. And he's also engaged a lot with the computer science community as well. So just wanted to say that up front. So what we think we know about the world is that the world is just made of mindless, meaningless particles and fields of force. And we think of ourselves as conscious, as having free will, as forming societies and cultures, and having human rights, and things like that. So how do you get from particles to politics, from electrons to elections? How do you kind of bridge that gap? And that's kind of one overriding question within contemporary philosophy. This is kind of a basic picture of how it all kind of connects together. Small things form systems that make bigger things. So the standard view is that the mind or consciousness is a biological phenomenon. We think we have really good reasons to believe that it's a biological phenomenon. If you take a class in neuroscience here at BYU, that's what they'll teach here at BYU, is that as far as we can tell, our brains has the causal mechanism sufficient to create consciousness. And then from consciousness, we do have language, which then allows for us to have certain complex social interactions that are not possible without language. So one thing I said about the mind is that we think we have good evidence that the mind is a biological phenomenon because there are correlations between conscious states and the neurobiology, and we're discovering more and more of those correlations, but we don't know how that actually happens. That's a huge open question within philosophy and neuroscience. We don't know how it happens. So let me start off by just defining consciousness. A lot of people say, oh, consciousness is so hard to define. Actually, it's very easy to define. But first, you got to kind of understand a little bit about definitions. And there's common sense definitions and scientific definitions. Just to give you an example of water, the scientific definition of water is that it's H2O. But before we had that definition, we knew a lot about water. Okay, so we knew that water was a clear, colorless, tasteless liquid. We knew all sorts of properties about water. And usually scientific definitions are the result of prolonged scientific study. They're not necessarily the starting place. With consciousness, we have a common sense definition, and that is that it's subjective states of awareness or sentience. Okay? These states begin when one wakes up in the morning and continue throughout the period that one is awake until one falls in a dreamless sleep, or is otherwise, as they say, unconscious. So anyway, so this is the definition of consciousness, and I think that this definition is sufficient for a lot of analysis that we can do about consciousness and about the mind. We don't actually know enough to formulate a scientific definition, so we don't have a scientific definition of what consciousness is. But we do have this common sense definition. One thing that this definition does not talk about is it doesn't say anything about free will. It's kind of agnostic to free will. So you could believe that we're completely determined or not, but that's not really what's at issue here. What's at issue is these subjective states of awareness or sentience. And when I say subjective, I mean that it is experienced by a subject, and I'll get into that a little bit. But what people used to say, and they used to say this a lot in neuroscience, which is my understanding, they used to say something like this. They used to say, consciousness is subjective, and science is objective. So you can never have a science of consciousness. And then the philosophers came along and said, well, that's a clear fallacy of ambiguity. And at the time, in neuroscience, people said, you could study consciousness if you want, but get tenure first. But now you can get tenure by studying consciousness. So it's completely flipped, because people used to think it was this kind of mysterious thing, but there's been a lot of progress in the past 50 years with understanding the neuronal correlates of consciousness. So anyway, when people say that consciousness is subjective and science is objective, what they're doing is they're kind of making a systematic ambiguity between the terms objective and subjective. Each of those terms have two different senses. So there's a sense in which they're relating to entities. So there's objective entities and subjective entities. And there's a sense in which it's relating to judgments. So there's objective judgments and subjective judgments. So subjective judgments, those would be things like opinions, whereas objective judgments, those would be things like facts. Okay? The technical term is epistemological objectivity or epistemological subjectivity. Just an example, saying that Leonardo da Vinci was born in 1452, that would be a fact. But saying that Leonardo da Vinci was a better artist than Michelangelo, that's more like an opinion, we would say. Okay, so that's what we mean when we're talking about objective and subjective in those senses. But when we're talking about ontology, we're talking about entities. Things that are ontologically objective or objective entities, those are things that exist regardless of what anyone thinks or believes. So if every conscious being in the universe were to disappear, this is what would be left over. So this is things like mountains, molecules, gravity, whatever, all of those things about reality, those are ontological entities. And then subjective entities are things that are experienced by a human subject. Okay, so they depend on being perceived by a certain subject. So these are things like beliefs and pains and tickles and things like that. So consciousness is a ontologically subjective entity, and watch the language here. So some philosophers talk. You can have an epistemologically objective science about a domain that is ontologically subjective. Okay, so that's why you can actually have a science of consciousness, even though consciousness is subjective in this sense. Does that make sense? Okay. There are also things that are ontologically subjective because they only exist because we believe that they exist. And if I was to talk a little bit more about society in the society section, I'd be talking about things like this. Money and marriage and touchdowns and school grades. These things only exist relative to our beliefs and our attitudes about those things. All right, so here are 12 aspects of consciousness. And I don't have time to go through all of them, but I'm just going to talk about one, and that is intentionality. And it's important that you understand what this term means, because they're going to be using it a lot, and it's easy to kind of be tripped up with intentionality. Intentionality is the ability of the mind to be about or directed at objects or affairs in reality. So intentionality is directedness. It sounds like the word intentions, but they're not actually the same word. Intentions are one form of intentionality, but intentionality relates to other things such as beliefs and desires, intentions, hopes and fears, these sorts of things. So this is an aspect of consciousness, and intentionality depends on consciousness for its existence. It doesn't make sense to talk about things in an intentional sense without consciousness. They just go together. Intentional states can be summarized by this notation. So there's a psychological mode and a propositional content. So a propositional content is something like, it will rain, and you can believe it will rain, fear it will rain, wish it will rain. And so these make up intentional states. These are examples of our intentional states. And an important distinction of intentionality is to distinguish between intrinsic ascriptions of intentionality and metaphorical ascriptions of intentionality. So intrinsic ascriptions refer to things that literally have the capacity for intentionality. Because intentionality is a biological phenomenon, because it's based on our consciousness, we have intentionality, and we think that other animals that have sufficient brain structures and similar kind of brain structures as us, they also have intentionality and consciousness, but we don't know how far it goes down. We don't know if termites are conscious or butterflies or whatever. Maybe they are, maybe they aren't, and we'll probably figure that out if we discover a scientific definition of consciousness. But at least right now, we can say that we have consciousness, intentionality, and so do other animals and things like this, but we don't know how far down it goes. There's just a lot of open questions there. Metaphorical as-if ascriptions of intentionality, these are things that we talk about as if they have intentionality when they really do not. So we may say that the car is thirsty for gasoline, or the goal of the plant is to survive, or that the computer is thinking. We use this way of talking about other things in the world as if they have intentionality. And for the most part, using language in this way isn't a problem. We use it just fine and understand each other just fine. It's only a problem when you confuse the two senses together. Okay, a couple more things about intentionality. The way in which the mind relates to the world, it has two senses. There's a mind-to-world direction of fit, and the world-to-mind direction of fit. So the mind-to-world direction of fit is when the mind matches the world. So if you have a true belief, that belief is true because it's an accurate representation of the way the world actually is. So that's the downward direction of fit. This is a very simple metaphor. We're like standing above the earth or the world, and kind of the world's just a representation of states of affairs in reality. But there's also the world to mind direction of fit, where the world changes to match the mind. So in those cases, let's say you have a desire that the world changes from one state to another. Well, that desire is satisfied when the world actually does change, and so you get the world to mind direction of fit because the world changed to match what was in the mind. So, for example, if you're trying to bully another player into a specific strategy in game theory, then you achieve a world to mind direction of fit when that other player succumbs to your strategy, just as an example. This is a very interesting chart, and I just don't have time to go through it. It deals with cognition and volition, and the sensory motor nervous system and motor nervous system, and different states of intentionality in terms of direction of fit, and also something else called direction of causality. We could talk about this more later, but I'm just kind of going to skip it for time right now. And then the last thing I want to say about intentionality is that intentional states don't function in isolation. They exist as part of an enormous network of other intentional states. Okay? So, just as an example, take the intentional state, the belief that Donald Trump intends to be president. In order to understand this, or in order for this intentional state to make sense, you need a huge network of other intentional states. So you need to believe something like the following. The United States is a republic. Whoever gets the most votes from the Electoral College becomes president. Those sorts of things. Maybe you're mistaken about some of those beliefs, but those are the types of beliefs that you would have in order to make sense of this intentional state. But then you also need a very deep background of other intentional states and presuppositions, such as the belief that elections are held on the surface of the earth and there are human beings. So you need all these sorts of other beliefs and presuppositions, at least accessible to consciousness, in order to make sense of kind of other intentional states that we have. So this is a very complex, enormous network. So just a summary so far of what I've kind of talked about. Consciousness are states of awareness or ascensions that are qualitative and ontologically subjective. Intentionality is directness, and it can be described by direction of fit. And intentional states always exist as part of a background network of other intentional states. So is there any comments or questions at this point about what I've said so far?
So we're sure there's no quantitative way of measuring consciousness?
Maybe there is if we had a definition of consciousness. I'm not ruling that out.
State of awareness or sentience that are qualitative and ontologically subjective. So you're saying qualitative meaning it's something that's just like ethereal that we don't really grasp yet.
No, what I'm saying is that the experience has a quality to it. That's what I mean. Not in terms of the measurement of it, like qualitative versus quantitative measurements. There's a different quality to that experience, and that's what's meant by qualitative.
I'm sure we said about world to mind, and like, are we sure like the world is changing because of the mind, or if the world happens to change and like it's not really just a mind to world relationship, you know?
Right. Yeah, you only achieve the world to mind direction of fit if the mind was the thing that caused the world to change. So you may be mistaken. Like, maybe, you know, that like those Groucho Marx films, they're funny because they're always messing with the background, as an aside. But anyway, he would do something and it would cause something else to happen, and he would think that he was causing that other thing to happen, but he really wasn't. And that was what was funny about the situation. So you may be mistaken in any given circumstance.
And like conscious beings usually have some capacity for acting in the world. So is that like proving we have this world to mind ability? You know?
Yeah, so I can give a simple proof of that right now.
Yeah.
So I'm going to intend to raise my arm in 2 seconds. I just caused my arm to raise. So that has the mind to world direction of fit with the world to mind direction of fit with the mind to world direction of causation, right? So I just caused my arm to go up. And I do have actually lots of slides kind of in the appendix about human action, and we can get into that more if you want. But that's the basic concept here. Okay, so that's the mind. I'm going to talk a little bit more about language. Language is an extension of our intentionality. That's really the idea here that I want to communicate. And there's a few features of language that I want to call attention to. And one is this distinction between syntax and semantics. Syntax relates to symbols and their organization, and also relates to the rules governing those symbols and that organization. So for example, the zeros and ones in a computer, those we count as syntax. Semantics is the meaning that we assign to the symbols. So if you have the symbols to spell out kangaroo, or simply the sound wave kangaroo, well, that has the meaning of that hoppy little animal in Australia. There's a dual level of intentionality here. So we first intend to make a sound with our mouth, or marks on a paper, or some bodily gesture. We first intend to do one of those things, and that would be the syntax. And then the second level of intentionality is when we intend for those things to carry a certain meaning. Okay? So the semantics is not intrinsic to the syntax. Does that make sense? You have to intend to do both at different levels of intentionality. Okay, so let's talk about speech acts. Speech acts are the basic or minimal unit of linguistic communication. A speech act is just anything you can do with language. And there are 5 and only 5 things that you can do with language. And each of these things has a direction of fit. So there's the word to world direction of fit, and the world to word direction of fit. You achieve the word to world direction of fit when your words match the way the world is. So if you say a true statement, that statement fits the way the world is if it accurately reflects the way the world is. The world to word direction of fit is when you change the world to match your words, right? So if I were to say, leave the room, and you all left the room as a result of me saying, leave your room, then that would achieve the world to word direction of fit. Okay? And there's one more thing you can do with language that you can't do with our pre-linguistic forms of intentionality. And that is you can have the dual direction of fit. And in this direction of fit, you change the world by representing it as being so changed. And that's something that's really remarkable and has huge implications for understanding society and social interaction. But I'll go through each of these speech acts one at a time. They each have their own kind of direction of fit. So assertives. Assertives can be true or false. These are things like statements and descriptions and classifications, and they correspond to beliefs. Examples include 2 + 2 = 4, or all men are mortal, for example. So someone teaching about a concept and trying to explain that concept would be making an assertive speech act. Anyone know who this is? It's John Nash, actually. So that's what he looks like. Okay, there's also directives. Directives have the upward direction of fit. So it doesn't make sense to say that a directive is true or false. These are things like orders and commands and requests, and these correspond to desires. And examples include pass the salt, bless the food, stop in the name of love. Those are all directives. And so here's an example of a directive. Speech acts don't require a spoken language or written language. They can just be gestures. Directives can be followed or ignored. There's also commissives, vows and pledges and threats. These correspond to our intentions. They also have the upward direction of fit, but they relate to the speaker, and they carry with it some social power in the form of obligations and things like this. So examples include, I now covenant with thee, or cooperate, or else I will invoke my trigger strategy, for an example. So commissives can be carried out or not. So here's an example. The bailiff asks the witness, do you swear to tell the truth, the whole truth, nothing but the truth? Something like that. And that's in a directive. And when he says, yes, I will, whatever he says, that's a commissive, right? He is committing himself to a certain course of action. Okay, so in the case of game theory, you could say, I promise to cooperate, or whatever, those sorts of things. Expressives don't have a direct direction of fit. They actually have a presupposed downward direction of fit, because an expressive presupposes a network of other intentional states, other things that have happened. So expressive things like thanking and apologizing and congratulating, right? And these are things like, congratulations for marrying a libertarian, sorry for stepping on your face, or simply in your face. And a good example of expressives are emojis. Okay, when we use these are expressives that are kind of assuming other states of affairs that are kind of going on in the world. We call that the precept direction of fit. And then there's declarations, which are really cool. And they have the dual direction of fit. Declarations are speech acts that make something the case by representing it as being the case. In Austin's language, these are performatives. But anyway, there's no correspondence to pre-linguistic intentional states, because you need the ability to represent things through language in order to bring about these sorts of changes in the world. So examples include, this meeting is adjourned, I now pronounce you husband and wife, or this note is legal tender for all that's public and private. So when we see that on a dollar bill, we see it says, this note is legal tender for all that's public and private. We don't ask the question, well, how do they know? Did they perform a scientific study? And we know that that's actually the wrong thing, the wrong way to approach it. Little green pieces of paper are money because we simply just declare them to be money. We just simply say, this is legal tender, and that fact that we have said that, and we all recognize that is the case, that's what makes it money. So here's just a couple of examples. So you can imagine 2 bathroom stalls, and the plumbing is exactly the same, no difference in the plumbing. But one has an icon of a female, and one has an icon of a male, and so we're simply just declaring, this one is the male restroom, this one is the female restroom, just by declaring it to be the case. Okay. Here's an example that kind of talks about all of these different speech acts, one that we're all kind of familiar with as religious students. But anyway, when the sacrament prayer is said, that's a directive. And that directive is asking God to bless the sacrament bread or the sacrament water. And to bless means to make something holy. To make something holy means that it's recognized by the divine. That's recognized as carrying a certain status. And so, if God recognizes that prayer, then there's a declaration going on where that sacrament bread is represented as carrying with it a certain status of being the sacrament bread. And a commissive speech act is when you actually take the bread or take the water, and that action is a speech act, where by doing that, you're promising to keep the commandments and always remember him and those sorts of things. Okay? And then there's a commissive speech act by God where he is promising that we will always have his spirit to be with us, those sorts of things. And you can think of someone praying during the sacrament and thanking God, and those would be an expressive speech act in that sense. Okay, so anyway, summary for this section here. Language is an extension of our biological pre-linguistic forms of intentionality. Syntax refers to symbols and their rules, and semantics is the meaning that conscious beings assign to the symbols. And there's 5 types of speech acts, each with their own kind of direction of fit and logical structure. So, any kind of questions or comments or discussion about this section? Yeah?
Which type of speech act is a question?
A question is a directive because you're requesting them to give you some information, or you're requesting for them to do something. So it's a directive. Yeah. So if I say, how are you? I want you. It's basically like me telling you, tell me how you are doing.
Seems like it's a little different.
Yeah, there is a little bit of different feel to it. I think that
You could
it's generally
sneak it under there, but
yeah. In the literature, that's what it's always classified as,
fair enough.
is a directive, and it may have some slight unique properties to it, but it's generally considered to be a request in that sense. Core confirmation information. Yeah, read.
Well, I was just going to ask, is this syntax, semantics, like really map onto like signifier and signified in like linguistic theory? Like, is it similar?
I've heard those terms, but I can't remember exactly what they mean. It sounds like there is a similarity there, but I don't remember for sure. So signified is, what's an example of signified?
I think it's like the actual object in the world, and then signifier is like whatever label associated kind of with that object.
All right, so that's the section on language. I'm going to say just a few things about society and social interactions. So the first thing I want to say about society is that there's a distinction between 2 different types of facts. There's observer-independent facts, and these things exist regardless of what anyone thinks or believes. These are intrinsic. These are things like forces, atoms, molecules, mountains, things like that. It's very similar to our distinction of ontological objectivity before, but it's slightly different, and I'll tell you why in a moment. There's also observer-relative facts, and these are things that exist only by assignment. They're in the eye of the beholder. To use the technical language, it's ontologically subjective. And these are things like money and elections and marriages and touchdowns, religious sacraments, and so forth. Consciousness itself is an intrinsic phenomenon, so it's observer-independent. And what I mean by that is that consciousness is observer-independent in the sense that I'm conscious regardless of what anyone thinks or believes. Okay? Or you are conscious regardless of what anyone thinks or believes. So it's an observer-independent phenomenon in that sense. Observer-relative facts, syntax is observer-relative because something only counts as syntax relative to our assignment of it as counting as syntax, right? Okay, the next concept is this concept of collective intentionality. And collective intentionality is when multiple minds are jointly directed at objects or states, affairs, and reality. So these are shared beliefs, shared desires, shared intentions, etc. And social facts are defined as any fact that involves collective intentionality. Things like 2 hyenas hunting a lion, or 2 humans playing a game, or Congress passing legislation, for example. And I think there's an interesting thing that kind of relates to something that Jack brought up early in the semester, and that is when we're talking about social AI, we're using that word really metaphorically. It's a metaphorical as-if ascription. At least that's how I interpreted what you said, Jack. But anyway, social facts in an intrinsic sense or a literal sense only relate to things that have kind of some sort of intrinsic intentionality. So that's just kind of an aside. There's a classical view which tries to define collective intentionality by reducing it to individual intentions. So the classical view is that I intend, and I believe that you intend, and you believe that I intend for infinity. That's kind of the classical view. And an alternative view, or a new view, and this is a huge area in philosophy right now, over the past 20, 25 years, and lots of new papers coming about this all the time, is basically saying that there are some forms, some social facts, some social situations where if you try to reduce the situation to the individual intentions of the actors, you actually leave a lot of the story out. You actually can't explain some types of social situations by trying to reduce it to the individual intentions of each agent. So let me give you an example. Here are two puzzles in game theory. The first puzzle is with prisoner's dilemma. And in prisoner's dilemma, game theory predicts that they should always defect. That's the Nash equilibrium. That's what game theory predicts. But when people test the prisoner's dilemma with real people, they end up cooperating between 40 and 50% of the time. And this is a big puzzle for game theorists and economists. Why do they do that? Another puzzle is the high-low game. And so in the high-low game, it's a cooperative game where if you both choose high, you each get a payoff of 2. If you both choose low, you only get a payoff of 1. But game theory cannot deduce that each rational player will choose high. All game theory can say is what you should do given what the other person is going to do. So all it can tell you is that if the other player chooses high, well, you should choose high. If the other player chooses 1, then you should choose 1. It can't actually predict that both players choose high. But we know, like, when we actually kind of play this out in real worlds, or with real people, we know that they always choose high. Above 95%, they'll always choose high. So one author, who's a game theorist, he says this is a very surprising result. He says, there is no sequence of steps of valid reasoning by which perfectly rational players can arrive at the conclusion that they ought to choose high. And that's really kind of strange. I actually was talking to Jacob Crandall about that, and he said, yeah, that's the case in game theory. It just can't predict that. And that's really weird, because we think intuitively, well, of course, it should be high. I'm going to skip this. So going back to collective intentionalities, the question is in this. Are there forms of reasoning which could recommend high in the high-low game, and which could explain why people actually cooperate in prisoner's dilemma? Even in one-shot games, they cooperate. And so the response is that collective reasoning may provide an answer if players move from what should I do form of reasoning to a what should we do form of reasoning. And philosophers and game theorists, what some of them do is they will talk about different reasoning schemas. So here's one schema from a paper that I think is super interesting called Collective Intentions and Team Agency. Schema 1 says, is all about individual rationality, and it says, I must choose either left or right. If I choose left, the outcome will be O1. If I choose right, the outcome will be O2. I want to achieve O1 more than I want to achieve O2, therefore I will choose left. Okay? But you could have collective rationality, where you formulate the rationality in these terms. We can either choose left, 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 right, right, left, or right, right. If we choose left, left, this will be the outcome. If we choose the others, there's a notation assigned to each of those outcomes. Let's say they want to choose, or they want to achieve outcome 1 more than any of the other outcomes, so therefore they're going to choose the strategy collectively that gives them that outcome instead of the other outcomes. And so there are also other sorts of schemas, and I won't go through them. One kind of schema that I've been thinking about and that I kind of was interested in talking about, but didn't have time, and the survey results showed that you weren't as interested in this, which is fine. But anyway, taking into account the social power that is created through the nature of speech acts, I believe leads people towards cooperative actions, or towards actions where it can explain those two puzzles of game theory. But anyway, we can maybe talk about that later. Let me skip ahead here. Okay, so I've kind of skipped over a lot, but what I want to say is that to understand social interactions, it depends on us understanding something about language. And to understand language, that depends on us understanding some things about consciousness and intentionality. Okay, so a summary for this section is that collective intentionality refers to shared intentional states that cannot always be reduced to individual intentionality. And social facts are any fact that involves this collective intentionality. There are the two puzzles in game theory that I mentioned, and collective reasoning may provide a framework to solve some of those puzzles. And the basic overview of understanding society requires some understanding of languages, which requires some understanding of intentionality and consciousness. So that's kind of the basics of this section here. So is there any comments or questions about that?
So why do you say game theorists can't determine that?
Well, game theorists can, but game theory cannot. There's nothing within game theory itself that would allow a person, that would provide a series of steps that would predict a high, that both players choosing high. Because my understanding is, and this is what it says in literature, all game theory can tell you is what you should do given what the other player will do. And so if the other player chooses high, well, that's what you should choose is also high. If the other player chooses low, then you should choose low.
What happens when I don't know if it's relevant at all, but like you can have a shared intentional state that's different than the other player's shared intentional state. So it's not the shared intentional state, just a different form of the individual state, but like just taking into account your, I don't know, maybe altruistic feelings of the other player.
Yeah,
Does that make sense what I'm saying?
I think so. I mean, in order for it to be collective intentionality, you have to have some shared state, so it can't be different. So you both have to collectively believe that you are acting for each other's good, or you both have to believe, other things. As long as they're shared, and as long as there's like a shared goal, then that can count as collective intentionality. There is like controversy on the details of that. So people have like dozens of definitions of collective intentionality that all involve kind of different pieces and parts and things like this. But it does involve some form of you have some sort of shared belief with the other player, right? So for example, let's say you go to the basement of the HVAC and you're walking by those rooms there where people are practicing musical instruments. Let's say that two people were practicing the piano and they both had headphones on, so they couldn't hear each other, but they were playing a perfect duet and they didn't even know it. Right? To you, it's like you're hearing this perfect duet, but to them, there's no collective intentionality happening, right? Because they're each individual and separate, and you're not aware of the other person's what the other person's doing. But when they actually are playing the piano as a duet, knowing the other person is playing as a duet, and they have that shared intentionality, that's a form of collective intentionality. So I don't know if I answered your question exactly, but those are just some thoughts about.
Or like in Prisoner's Dilemma, we have to be on the same page about cooperating.
Right.
For it to be a shared intentional state, basically. Or we could be on the same page about perfecting things. But as soon as one of us is like, I'm going to do the other thing and benefit myself, that's no longer really a shared intentional state, correct?
Right. So in the paper, Collective Intentions and Team Agency, the authors say that you can achieve an action equilibrium and you can achieve some form of cooperation without collective intentionality. You need something more than just reacting to what you think the other person is doing. So yeah, it's kind of interesting. Okay, there's 3 positions that I'm going to go over concerning consciousness, machines, and computers. And those positions depend on the answers to 2 separate questions. So the first question is, could we make an artificial conscious machine? Second question is, could we make a conscious machine through computation alone? Position A, which is also called cognitivism, says yes to both of those. Position B says you could make an artificial machine, but computation alone is not sufficient to create consciousness. And position C says you can't do either of those things. So let me go a little bit more detail about these different positions. So position A is they believe that brains cause consciousness, that the brain is literally a computer, and that we will one day be able to program a computer to be conscious. That's position A. People that hold this position, philosophers Daniel Dennett and David Chalmers, and the chief futurist at Google, Ray Kurzweil. Ray Kurzweil believes that by 2029 we will achieve some, what he calls human level, form of artificial intelligence through computers, and he thinks that not long after that we'll be able to upload our minds to computers and live in this beautiful utopia inside of a computer. That's what he argues, that's what he believes. Position A believes in this. So he programs a computer, a consciousness.dat file, and it's stable. And he achieves consciousness with the computer.
What movie is this?
Chappie.
Chappie.
Chappie. And the robot is raised by gangsters and he becomes this gangster robot. And so position A says that's all you need. All you need is a computer, and you just need to type into the terminal the right algorithms, and you can create consciousness. That's what position A says. Here's position B. Position B says that brains are cause consciousness. Brains are machines, and it's a logical possibility that we could create an artificial conscious machine, but computation alone is not sufficient to create a conscious machine. People that hold this view is John Searle, the theoretical mathematician Sir Roger Penrose, and Herbert Dreyfus is a recent philosopher as well. So I'm going to show you another clip from Blade Runner 2049.
Mirror data makes a man. A and C and T and G. The alphabet of you. All from 4 symbols. I'm only 2. 1 and 0.
Half as much, but twice as elegant, sweetheart.
Okay, so this is Blade Runner 2049. He is a replicant. He is an artificially, synthetically created person, and he was made, fully grown with memories implanted in him, with the background implanted in him, so to speak. She is a computer that's just a projection from a device that he carries around in his pocket. She is kind of his girlfriend that he bought this device to have a digital girlfriend. So position B would say, well, he most likely has the appropriate causal mechanisms to have consciousness, but she is purely made out of just computer code, ones and zeros. She's just a really, really good simulation, right? She's not really conscious. And there's an interesting part in the movie, later in the movie, after his girlfriend, his digital girlfriend dies, he kind of has this realization or this doubt that she ever was conscious. It was kind of this interesting thing. So this actually relates very well to position B. Here's another movie.
We have her mind. Structured gel. I had to get away from circuitry. I needed something that could arrange and rearrange on a molecular level, but keep its form when required. Holding for memories, shifting for thoughts.
This is your hardware?
Wetware.
Okay, so the other guy asks, "This is your hardware?" And he says, "Wetware." Wetware is taken directly from John Searle. They actually interviewed a lot of philosophers for this film. It's very kind of interesting. But position B would say, well, the main robot character in this movie, Ex Machina, she could be conscious because she has some causal mechanism that's sufficient to create consciousness. So that's position B. Yeah, we.
So are you saying consciousness is a physical thing?
Yes. Well, I'm saying that position B holds that brains cause consciousness.
But
That consciousness emerges from the
But
neurobiology.
you
of
can't
brains.
simulate a brain through a computer. That's what position B is.
Position B says you can simulate a brain through a computer, but you cannot emulate a brain through a computer.
So it can't be like fully conscious.
Yeah, you can't have consciousness from a computer.
So they say like because of the physical aspect of the brain that has been conscious.
There's some biological aspect that can't be obtained in just.
Right. There is some aspect. That aspect may require the biology, or maybe it can produce artificially in some other medium. But there actually needs to be some like literal energy transfers that are sufficient to duplicate the causal processes that give rise to consciousness. That's what they say. Position C, thank you, says consciousness cannot be created artificially at all, either because it's not part of the physical world, or because it cannot be explained mechanically or computationally in any sense. So people that would believe this would be Descartes and Plato. Maybe Joseph Smith believed this because he said intelligence cannot be created, neither can be. I don't think that we're forced to that conclusion. I don't think we know enough about what is meant by intelligence. So I think that it's kind of a big question mark, and these the other positions I think are open to us as practicing members of the Church of Jesus Christ, for example. To summarize the three positions, could we make an artificial conscious machine, or could we make a conscious machine through computation alone? Each of those has kind of a different answer to that. I am going to present what I think are some fatal mistakes that are made by position A. Okay. Before I do that, I'm going to lay out a few more conceptual categories. So, just going to give you a definition of artificial intelligence. There are dozens of definitions. In philosophy and in science fiction, AI just refers to any man-made machine that can think and or act like a human. Definition 2 is just a buzzword for new computer technology. So this is a picture of a kind of billboard at the Computer Electronics Show in Las Vegas this year, and they're advertising TVs, and they've got AI upscaling, AI streaming technology, AI content, and AI sound, all powered by a quantum processor, 8K. And so it's not just that it's a buzzword, but the meaning of AI really changes every generation. So Kevin Kelly, for example, of Wired Magazine, he says, what we can do now would have been considered AI 50 years ago, but in 50 years from now, they're not going to consider what we're working on now as AI. It's this thing that changes. So here's an example of some technologies that people used to consider AI, like object-oriented programming, for example, but people don't consider those AI anymore. So it's really like a not very well-defined term kind of in either in academia or in the industry. There's a distinction I want to make between two different types of robots, simulations versus emulations. So you can imagine two robots that both look human, but they're very different. To simulate means to imitate or mimic or pretend, to give the appearance of, okay? So simulation would not be conscious. It would just be a zombie. It would just look like it was conscious, but it wouldn't have anything there. We can only talk about simulations in the form of as-if intentionality. Emulations, these are things, at least in the way that I'm using the word here, they reproduce or duplicate the functions of a system in a way that is causally identical to the thing being emulated. Okay, so this would be a robot that actually was conscious, for example. And it's important to kind of understand this distinction because this distinction really undermines the Turing test. Because the Turing test basically says if it looks like it's intelligent, if it looks like a duck, right, then it is a duck, or then it is intelligent. But consciousness is a little bit more different from that. And so the way that some people interpret the Turing test, there is some debate about what Alan Turing actually meant. So, to your question about artificial, there are two senses of the word artificial. In one sense, we can refer to things that are not real, just an imitation, like this beautiful artificial butter here. In another sense, it can refer to things that are real, but just not made by natural means. So, artificial diamonds, they actually have exactly the same molecular structure as a real diamond. They are real diamonds, but they're just not produced by natural means. And so these are the two different ways of talking about artificial. But simulation AI is artificial in the sense that it's not real, just a simulation or imitation. Emulation is artificial in the sense of being real, just not produced naturally. There's also this distinction between weak AI and strong AI. These terms were actually coined by John Searle in 1980. If you read blogs about artificial intelligence, then people kind of make up all sorts of definitions of what they think these words mean. But in the original sense in which these words were defined, weak AI is not a type of machine, it's an assumption. And that assumption is that a computer software plus hardware alone can simulate a human mind. And strong AI is the assumption, because it's making a strong claim, that's why it's called strong AI. It's the assumption that computer software plus hardware alone can emulate a human mind. There is kind of differences within position B. So John Searle, for example, he believes that a computer could fully simulate a human mind. Whereas Roger Penrose, for example, he uses Gödel's theorem and the halting problem, and he talks about things that humans can do that computers could never simulate. And he has some interesting arguments there. I don't fully understand them. So, what is a computer? It's important to get a really clear definition of what computers are. Computers are machines that can do syntactical manipulation, and they're based on the theoretical concept of a Turing machine. So we all know Turing machine from our studies of the computational theory, and it's a machine with a tape head and a tape and a set of instructions where the tape head moves along the tape and changes the symbols along the tape. And this is the model for all computation. So just as an example from our textbook from that class, it says, we now set up a format and notation for describing Turing machines. The input to a Turing machine is always a string. If we want to provide an object other than the string as input, we must first represent that object as a string. A Turing machine may be programmed to decode the representation so that it can be interpreted in the way that we intend. So a string is just a list of symbols. So what this means is that computers' computation are defined purely syntactically. So now I'm going to go through what I think are 3 fatal mistakes made by position A. Remember that position A says that computation alone is sufficient for the production of consciousness. So I think the first mistake that they make is misunderstanding the relationship between syntax and semantics. So here's the basic argument. Computation is defined purely syntactically. Premise 2, consciousness is constituted by mental content, specifically semantic contents. So there's meanings right in the head. Premise 3, semantics is not intrinsic to the syntax. So when we talked about the difference between syntax and semantics, we said that the semantics is what gets assigned to the syntax from a conscious agent. Conclusion, therefore computation alone is not sufficient to create consciousness. Okay? All right, so mistake 2, misunderstanding the relationship between syntax and the physics. I want to talk about this concept of multiple realizability, which says that a Turing machine can be realized with any hardware with a physics that is sufficient enough to carry out the operations that we want. So it could be transistors through which electrical currents flow. It could be a hydraulic system through which water flows, where there's different gates and the water could be empty or full, and we can count those as ones or zeros. Someone wrote a paper in the 80s saying that you could build a computer out of cats and mice and cheese, where the cats were tied with a string to a gate and chasing the mice and lifting up the gates, and the mice go through and everything. And another person wrote a paper saying that you could train pigeons to peck as a Turing machine. It could even be carried out by the human mind. We could just kind of carry out the steps of a computation with our mind. We don't have a good enough memory, so maybe we'd have to use a piece of paper or whatever to remind us. But this is the concept of multiple realizability. And the point here is that the hardware realization is irrelevant. The gates work in different ways, but they are nonetheless computationally equivalent. Okay, so the argument 2 that relates to mistake 2 has the same premise as argument 1, which is that computation is defined syntactically. Premise 2 is that syntax is not intrinsic to the physics. Remember, syntax is observer relative. Something counts as a 1 or 0 only because we are the ones assigning it that interpretation. So you can think of computation in an observer-independent sense, which is computation performed intentionally by a human agent. So that would be intrinsic computation. We could also think of it in an observer-relative sense. So computation done on the implementation of a Turing machine would just be observer-relative. So the conclusion is that computation is not discovered in the physics. Computation is assigned to the physics. The syntactical interpretation is always in the eye of the beholder. And then the last mistake is confusing the model with reality. So you can do a simulation of a rainstorm, but it's not going to make you wet. You could do a computer simulation of digestion, but you can't shove a pizza into your hard drive and have it actually digest the pizza. Computers cannot pump blood no matter how good your algorithms are. You actually need a physical machine that does the pumping of the blood. And you should think of consciousness as a biological phenomenon, at least under the view that I'm presenting, like digestion or the pumping of blood. No matter how good computers get in the future, they will never be able to pump blood. Okay, you actually need a physical machine to do that, and you need an actual machine with the right causal mechanisms to do that, and it's really the same thing with consciousness. So computers will not get us there, even if they progress for 1,000 years, a million years, whatever. You can simulate a mind on a computer, but not actually emulate it. Okay, so 2 questions. Can computers think? This actually has 2 different interpretations. One, you could say, can something be a computer and also think? And here the answer is yes. Humans can both think and do simple manipulation. In fact, the word computer originally applied to humans. It was used kind of like we use the word accountant, just referred to people that perform this, that do computations. Interpretation 2 is the computer by itself constitutive of or sufficient for thinking? And here the answer is no, because computer programs are purely syntactical, and the syntax by itself is not sufficient to cause consciousness, and the syntax isn't even intrinsic to the physics of a hardware. Second question, okay, so is the brain a computer? And the trivial result is yes, since anything can really be assigned a computational interpretation. And the trivial result 2 is no, since nothing is intrinsically computational. So therefore, it could not be discovered that the brain or anything else was intrinsically a digital computer. The question is ill-formed. So if you think I said that the brain is a computer has the answer of false, that's actually misunderstanding what I'm saying. It doesn't even rise to the level of falsehood. It's technically incoherent under the view that I'm presenting. It's like trying to say, is Mount Timpanogos a prime number? It has no answer. It's just kind of incoherent. It's the same thing with trying to compare the brain to a computer. So if we go back to the 3 positions, what I'm arguing is that position A makes those 3 mistakes that are fatal to the theory, and position B and C are open to you. And I'll let you kind of think about which one you believe in, or maybe you still believe in position A and that I've made some mistake along the way, which is possible as well. So throughout our history, whenever a new technology comes out, people always use that new technology as a metaphor for the mind. So people used to write about the mind being like a mill or like a water pump. When the steam engine came out, people said, oh, the mind is like a steam engine. When the clock came out, said, no, the mind is really like a clock. People thought the mind was like a telegraph switchboard. And now people tend to say that the mind is like a computer. And I think the computer is probably no better or no worse a metaphor for the brain than earlier mechanical metaphors. But we learn just as much about the brain as saying it's a computer as we do by saying it's a telephone switchboard or a steam engine or anything like that. So here's kind of the last quote by John Searle, who says, "Suppose no one knew how clocks worked. Suppose it was frightfully difficult to figure out how they worked, because though there were plenty around, no one knew how to build one, and efforts to figure out how they worked tended to destroy the clock. Now suppose a group of researchers said, we will understand how clocks work if we design a machine that is functionally the equivalent of a clock, that keeps time just as well as a clock. So they designed an hourglass and claimed, now we understand how clocks work. Or perhaps, if we could only get the hourglass to be just as accurate as a clock, we would at last understand how clocks work. Substitute brain for clock in this parable, and substitute digital computer program for hourglass, and the notion of intelligence for the notion of keeping time, and you have the contemporary situation in much of artificial intelligence and cognitive science." So in summary, there's the 3 positions. There are the different senses of artificial intelligence. There's a definition of computer as a purely syntactical machine, and there are the 3 fatal mistakes that I believe are made by position A, also known as cognitivism. So that's it. That's my presentation. Is there any comments or questions in the last minute of class? Yeah, Robert.
I don't understand semantics.
Okay.
You didn't talk about like where they come from. You said that they're not derived from the syntax.
Yeah.
Don't talk about
Semantics.
What composes semantics? You know?
Semantics is the meaning that we assign to the syntax. Does that make sense?
Uh-huh.
So when I talked about kangaroo, the sound wave kangaroo is just a sound wave. It has no intrinsic meaning whatsoever. But we assign the meaning of that hoppy animal in Australia to that sound wave, kangaroo. So that's what I mean by semantics. That is what's meant in linguistics and philosophy about semantics. Now sometimes we use the word semantics differently in other contexts. People will use that same word and give it a different definition. And so that confuses the debate, but yeah. Yeah, question.
When we make babies, are babies artificial intelligence?
They're natural intelligence.
Is there not?
Right. Yeah, I'm making one in a couple weeks from now, actually. Thank you. How about we just end it there? Thanks, guys.